July 1st, 2026 was supposed to pass the way it always does. A short royal statement. A handful of flowers laid by an aide. A quiet nod to what would have been Princess Diana's 65th birthday. And then the palace machine moving on to the next thing on the calendar. That is what happened every year since 1997. This year, it didn't happen that way. Instead, a 22-year-old granddaughter of Prince Philip did something nobody had scripted, nobody had approved, and nobody in the press office saw coming. And by that evening, it was the only thing royal watchers were talking about. This is not just a sentimental gesture from a minor royal nobody pays attention to. This concerns how a family that has spent nearly 3 decades tightly managing Diana's memory is now watching one of its quietest members handle that memory entirely on her own terms. It touches the monarchy's oldest unresolved question: who gets to decide what Diana's legacy actually means, the institution or the people who actually loved her? Let's get into it. To understand why this moment landed the way it did, it helps to know why July 1st almost went by like every other overlooked anniversary, what Lady Louise Windsor actually did once the cameras weren't supposed to be looking, how a young woman who never met Diana ended up carrying her memory more visibly than almost anyone else in the family, and why insiders now say this quiet afternoon may be reaching further into the monarchy's future than anyone expected. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1st, 1961, and died on August 31st, 1997, at 36 years old. For most of the 29 years since, her birthday has been marked the same modest way: a short statement from Kensington Palace, sometimes a photograph reissued from the archives, occasionally a charity mentioning her name in a newsletter nobody outside its mailing list ever reads. William and Harry have historically kept the day low profile, and royal commentator Ingrid Seward has noted in past interviews that the family prefers to let the date pass with dignity rather than spectacle, a pattern that has held for nearly 3 decades and shows no sign of loosening from the institution's side. The one clear exception was July 1st, 2021, Diana's 60th birthday, when William and Harry stood together in the sunken garden at Kensington Palace to unveil a bronze statue of their mother, a rare moment of brothers appearing side by side during a period when their relationship was already fraying in public. That statue became the closest thing the family had to an official monument to Diana, and since then, every following July 1st has felt smaller by comparison, a formality rather than an event. 5 years on, expectations for her 65th had settled back into the usual pattern of a brief mention and nothing more, which is part of why what actually happened caught so many people off guard. Lady Louise Alice Elizabeth Mary Mountbatten Windsor was born in November 2003, 6 years after Diana's death, which means she never knew her aunt by marriage at all. Her father, Prince Edward, is King Charles's younger brother, making Diana her uncle's first wife, rather than any blood relation. There was no childhood bond to draw on, no memory to reach back into. And yet Louise grew up inside the same family orbit as William and Harry, close enough to hear the stories, even if she never lived them, close enough to understand exactly what July 1st meant to her cousins, even though it meant nothing to her personally. At 22, Louise is 17th in line to the throne, a position that keeps her mostly outside the spotlight by design, and, by most accounts, by her own preference too. What she has built a name for, quietly, over the last several years, is carriage driving, the sport her grandfather Prince Philip devoted much of his later life to before his death in 2021. Sarah Howe, who runs the Bradbourne Riding and Training Centre in Sevenoaks, where Louise trains, said earlier this year that she is doing extremely well with the time and the commitment of everything else she has to do, adding a detail that has become something of a signature line among people who know her. "You would never know who she is. She is just Louise." In May 2026, she worked as a chief organizer at the Royal Windsor Horse Show, running a concierge operation most attendees never realized was overseen by the King's niece, and she and her mother, the Duchess of Edinburgh, took part together in the Pole Roger Meet of the British Driving Society's carriage parade that same month. It is not a glamorous royal job. It is early mornings, mucked-out stables, and a competitive circuit where almost nobody recognizes her name. That is the young woman who, according to sources close to the household, quietly excused herself from a family engagement on the afternoon of July 1st. The first thing insiders noticed was an absence. Louise was expected at a low-key Windsor engagement that afternoon, and she wasn't there. A palace source told the Daily Mail that she had asked days in advance not to be scheduled for anything after 2 o'clock, without giving a reason. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Royals reshuffle their diaries constantly, and a missing afternoon slot for the 17th in line to the throne is not, on its own, a headline. But this was not just an absence from a minor diary slot. It was a deliberate, private choice about where to spend an afternoon nobody was watching, and what she did with those hours became the real story. According to an account shared with OK magazine by someone present at Kensington Gardens that afternoon, Louise arrived alone, without protection officers visibly in tow, and walked to the Diana Memorial Playground, the same gated garden she used to visit as a small child with her mother, Sophie. She reportedly stayed for close to 40 minutes, sat on a bench near the teepee structure for a long stretch, and left a single handwritten card tucked among the flowers already gathered at the site. No statement. No official photographer. Just a young woman who never met the person she was there for, spending the better part of an hour with a memory that was never hers to begin with. The most dramatic detail didn't come from the palace at all. It came from ordinary visitors. A mother who was at the playground with her own children posted a short video online, later picked up by Hello, and several tabloids showing Louise crouched by the flowers for several seconds before standing and walking away, unnoticed by most of the people around her. Royal commentator Robert Jobson, writing shortly after, called it the most human tribute to Diana this family has produced in years, and noted that it stood in sharp contrast to the brief, carefully worded statement Kensington Palace ultimately released that evening, one that made no mention of Louise at all, running to barely 3 sentences and crediting no single family member by name. Sources close to William say he was reportedly moved when he was told what had happened, in part because the gesture echoed something his mother used to do herself. Show up somewhere, unannounced, without cameras arranged in advance, because she wanted to be there, not because she was told to be. One insider went further, telling a Sunday tabloid that William had asked his office, quietly, whether Louise would be willing to talk about the Vistners and mer. What makes this land so hard is the contrast sitting right at the center of it. On one side, there is the institution's version of remembering Diana, a press release, a stock photograph pulled from the archive, a sentence approved by 3 different people before it goes out into the world. On the other side, there is a 22-year-old who has spent her entire public life being coached to stay in the background, choosing entirely on her own to step toward the one part of the family's history that was never really hers to claim. She wasn't Diana's niece by blood. She wasn't raised with stories of her at bedtime, and she still went, alone, on a Wednesday afternoon nobody was watching. There is real tension sitting inside that choice. Louise's own mother, Sophie, has spent years carefully building a reputation as one of the family's steadiest, least controversial figures, someone who deliberately avoids creating moments like this. For her daughter to generate the most talked-about royal story of the week entirely by accident and entirely without the family's usual machinery behind it is not a small thing inside a household that has spent nearly 30 years trying to control exactly this kind of moment. It raises a quieter, more uncomfortable question too. If the family's most guarded, least attention-seeking member is the one who felt compelled to go, what does that say about everyone who didn't? There is also an irony that several commentators have pointed to since. Louise's own arrival into the family was itself a near crisis, a premature birth in 2003 that briefly made front-page news and forced the palace to issue hourly medical updates, while the rest of the country waited to hear if she would be all right. She has spent every year since being shielded from exactly that kind of attention, raised deliberately outside the working royal spotlight her cousins were born into. that the one moment she has generated real, unmanufactured headlines came not from scandal or ambition, but from a private walk to a children's playground, says something about how differently this generation seems to understand what the public actually responds to. What this means going forward is still unsettled. Diana's memory has always belonged officially to the institution that outlived her. But every year, the people carrying it forward are a step further removed from ever having known her at all. And somehow, this year, it was the most distant of them who reminded Britain what it actually felt like to miss her.